welcome. And first of all, as you can see from that long list of people on the screen, this is a very collaborative effort, all female at the moment, but we can rectify that if you wish. So basically, this is a birds of a feather session. So therefore, seeding the idea for a concrete activity that we are planning, but also the idea of how we could incorporate it perhaps in RDA or not. So this is the discussion we'd also like to have with you. Of course, we need to give you some context about what is this open science registry on rewards and incentives, and where does it come from, and why is it branded RDA? So maybe if we go to the second slide. Oh yeah, so I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of the origins of it, very briefly, and then Rebecca and Katrina are going to give you more in-depth detail about the vision and why and how and what are the plans around it. We'll talk a little bit about the governance and sustainability and ways of getting involved and contributing. And then we're going to do a questions and answers. Katrina has prepared a Mentimeter, which we will be putting on at that time. I'd ask you, if you don't mind, we will be able to capture the Mentimeter results, but if there are other questions or things that you ask, if you would help us and use the collaborative notes for those as well, because then we're able to capture more. We're not sure how much of the chat we will have access to afterwards, so we use the Google Doc, if you don't mind. And then we'll go into the next steps, and of course, a discussion. So we'll try for it not to be death by PowerPoint, but it is true that to give you the context, of course, and the practical examples, we have a support and material. I'd like to thank my colleagues very much. So as you probably saw from the first slide, we have the University of Madrid from Eva Mendes, who I'm not sure if she's on or not, but poor Eva's in Australia, so it's one of those terrible time zones. Rebecca Lawrence from F1000 Research, who has been driving the slide sharing and also the activities around this work. It's all a volunteer effort, like many of the ones that we do. Katrina McCallum from Hindawi, who is Mentimeter lady today and also support very much behind the conception of the idea that I'll explain where it came from. Vanessa Proudman, who's the Spark Europe director, Anna Hatch from DORA, who's the program director, and Michelle, last but not least, who's also in Australia, Michelle Barker from the Research Software Alliance. So we have come together to do this. So why did we come together, and how did this idea form? So the European Commission, about 4 or 5, maybe 6 years ago even, created an open science policy platform in Europe, which had a series, about 25 different pan-European stakeholders. So they were stakeholders from different, representing different areas of the open science landscape and ecosystem. And they were more not, if you like, national level activities on a European level, but more of a pan-European, as I said, and in many cases international. And those in the second round of that policy platform, where Eva Mendes was the chair of the Open Science Policy Platform, and Katrina and Rebecca, particularly, if I may say so, came up with the concept around of this open science registry to showcase, if you like, and analyze and provide more detail on the rewards and incentives mechanism, as it has clearly emerged from the work that policy platform did, that this is one of the obstacles, of course, to open science, and it needs more support. And the idea that a registry, not just European indeed, but international, would be required by many of the stakeholders, the funders themselves, the researchers, the institutions that are working around that. So during the last meeting and before that report that you see on the right of the screen, and there's a link there to it, was produced, we discussed how could we pragmatically start this off, because everybody agreed in the Open Science Policy Platform and with their peers that we had been discussing with as well, that this did seem to be a necessity. So given the international scope and the independent, if you like, type bottom-up forum, the Research Data Alliance candidated itself to, if you like, coordinate it and to try and seek international funding and ensure that this was an endeavour that goes to the benefit of all. So we, I think I'll leave it at that and state that, so that is where we are. We are starting on this adventure, and I will let Rebecca talk more about, and with Katrina, about exactly what this consists of. And of course, please feel free to interrupt us because you have control of your own microphones. And the slides, maybe while you're talking, Rebecca, I can share them, can't I? I share a link to them. Or a
You
copy of
can,
them.
absolutely.
All right,
Please do. That would be helpful. Great. Thank you very much, Hilary, for the introduction, and hello, everybody. Great to be talking with you about the Open Science Registry. What Katrina and I are going to do now is really just give a bit of context, or I'm going to give a bit of context and background as to sort of how we came to the conclusion this was an important thing to put together, and start to explain a little bit about it, and then I'll hand over to Katrina, who'll try and explain much more about what it is, what the concept is, and what we're thinking about, and what it might look like, to try and hopefully explain what we're trying to achieve here. So a bit of background, Hilary's covered a bit of this already, but just in terms of give you the context of some of our thinking about it. So as Hilary pointed out, with the Open Science Policy Platform, we had sort of two-year mandates. And the first one, we really focused around delivering a series of recommendations across the 8 pillars of open science that the EC had come, or EU had come up with. And identifying, who are the core stakeholders to really help drive delivery of those recommendations. But one of the things as we moved from the first mandate to the second mandate that we were very, very aware of is it's all very well having all these recommendations that we all sort of collectively come to, but actually is a real challenge in getting adoption of those recommendations, in the sense that the pivotal element of this is around the current evaluation system and the fact that ultimately it largely forces researchers to focus on research articles as the output and to seek publication in sort of high impact venues. And unless we adjust that, it's actually very hard to incentivize researchers to behave in an open research way and to do many of the things that we'd sort of recommended within those recommendations. So we decided as a policy platform that the second mandate, so the last 2 years that we were working, it was very important for us to really focus around how do we address this, and how do we really, collectively together come to thinking about trying to shift the focus of rewards and incentives at all levels. So not just for research and researchers, but also for research projects, for institutions, all the way up. And how do we, enable a much broader uptake of next generation metrics and of the use of much more responsible metrics. So just to sort of support some of this, there was some interesting survey data that a number of groups have done, which I'm just going to show you, which really highlight this. And I think particularly this survey that the European Universities Association did last year. And this is a survey of their members, asking them, what types of academic work matter the most for research careers. And this is just incredibly stark. I know we all kind of know this, but I think seeing this data really brings it home. Research publications by far and away are seen as the absolute most important element of what matters for a research career, and open science and open access and adoption of that and use of that is seen as, out of this list, the least important in terms of affecting research careers. Similarly, if you look at funders, so this is a survey that Spark Europe did, and they analysed a broad range of funders to say, well, what are the key things that they see as crucial criteria when they're evaluating. There's a couple of things here, but two of the big things on here are the number of peer-reviewed articles and the number of citations of those publications. So it's still very focused around publications, peer-reviewed articles, and a very narrow area. Another piece of data from that survey, which I think was really interesting. So this is looking at funders which either have or have not got an open access and research data or research data policy. So if you look at those that do have open access and research data policies, even despite that, the vast majority of them do not use open science criteria as part of the grant evaluation. And obviously those that don't have the policies, you might imagine, don't. So it really sort of gives you a bit of a sense of the challenge. Now, there are lots of reports and frameworks out there that have been developed over the last few years. Some of the really crucial ones are things like the Leiden Manifesto, the Metric Tide, more recently the Hong Kong Principles, that are really trying to look at providing tools to support the use of responsible metrics when assessing research. There are initiatives such as DORA, so the San Francisco Declaration of Research Assessment. They've really been trying to drive a movement and get support and a real shift. So there's been a lot going on. So there's a lot of, as I say, frameworks on how to do this. Some of the key elements I think that we felt as a platform were really crucial that came out of this were particularly around managing and planning for unintended consequences of, and so even if you move towards other metrics, making sure that we kind of think forward about potential unintended consequences and indeed the steering effect of an indicator. So it's no good just moving from one problematic indicator to another indicator, because actually all that will do is just steer people's focus in a certain direction. And so actually it's about a broad range of metrics. It's about making sure that we don't create incentives that are actually for superficial changes, and it's tick boxing that looks like you're actually shifting your behaviors, but really truly in essence there isn't a true change in behavior. And as I say, you need a suite of indicators, and those differ depending on what you're looking at and depending on the field you're in and the type of project and the entity that you're measuring, i.e. is it an individual or is it a researcher or research? Is it a project? Is it an institution? All those different elements, the many different elements that really change what indicators you want to be looking at and using. And I say it needs to be a suite of indicators, not an individual one. There was also a report that came out last year, 2019, from Paul Wouters and colleagues. So this is an EU expert group report, which really built on particularly the Leiden Manifesto and the Metric Tide, but also other documents as well, and pulled them together into a series of further frameworks. And one of the crucial things that they really looked at and built sort of frameworks for is at the different levels, because we often talk about, assessment of researchers or research, but often not beyond that. And actually this is all interlinked. So, it's really important. This is one of the things that really came through in the report, that we think also about, research assessments of research groups, of research performing organizations and funding organizations, and then indeed of the system as a whole, and looking into infrastructures and assessment of those that are required for open science and how all of those interlink, because it's very difficult to change. You can't just change one without necessarily affecting the broader group. There's also a very large number of indicators available, so we're not short of indicators. That Paul Wouters report that I just mentioned has a table at the end. I think it has about 140 indicators on there. It's actually an amazing table. It's well worth looking at, where that group went through each one and looked at their strengths, their weaknesses, potential risks, when they're good to use, how to access them, literature references, all sorts of really, really valuable information going through each of those. So we have lots of indicators. We even, amazingly, have a periodic table of indicators. It shows just how many of them are there. So I say we're not short of them. That doesn't necessarily mean we have all the ones that we need. But what I'm trying to get across is, a lot of the tools that we need are there and are available in various places. The other the other thing that we do have, which one of the other EC expert group reports brought together a couple of years earlier, was this matrix, essentially, OSCAM, which is the Open Science Career Assessment Matrix. And so I'm not going to go through all of this, but this really is coming up with a series of different things that assessment teams, whether it's at an institutional level or a group level or a funder level or whatever, can use, ideally integrated with existing tools. So the idea is this isn't a sort of separate assessment matrix, because you don't want to, it's kind of the normal one versus the open science one. The idea is to integrate these two. But it's suggestions of other elements, not just research outputs or examples there, but also other things you might do, in terms of recognizing leadership, let's say, or peer review activity, or communication, or teaching, or supervision, all sorts of different things that are actually really important to sort of rounded researcher, and will differ, as I pointed out earlier, depending on the sort of individual you're looking at, the sort of group that you're looking at, and what it is that you're trying to assess and incentivize ultimately. I mentioned Dora briefly earlier, and Anna Hatch will be talking a little bit more about some of the work that they're doing at the moment. But just a sort of brief summary, they have been really focusing for a number of years now in trying to drive a movement towards much more holistic and balanced research evaluation system. There's a whole raft of organisations that are supporting them, as you can see there, but they've been incredibly successful at getting support, both from organisations. You can see there's over 2,000 organisations who've signed up to the set of principles that they put together, and thousands of individuals as well. And they've now been doing some really interesting work pulling together some good practices across funders, professional societies and research institutes. And it's well worth a look, having a look on their website and looking at the examples they've got there. They're sort of short summaries of what different organisations are doing around the world to start to shift their assessment process. And I've just pulled out a couple of examples here, but you can see some major organisations, so Cancer Research UK and the Austrian funder FWF are both looking at assessing researchers around research outputs around focusing on 3 to 5 or 10 of the most important outputs, well, not just a list of publications, but actually what are those outputs, and asking for descriptions of significance and impact. And you can see from the list there that they're looking at research publications, but they're also looking at a whole mass of other types of outputs beyond standard articles, which I think is really important and great to see. The NIH obviously use the biosketches, but again, they're looking more towards summary of impacts of contributions rather than just, again, sort of list of publications. You've got University Medical Centre Utrecht, who have been involving researchers at all career stages to co-develop their policies, which is really interesting, and how they measure sort of societal impact and research excellence. And the point is that the idea is that as a group or a team almost, there's sort of agreement that this is how the criteria by which to be judged. So there's lots of great examples. I just pulled a couple out there that are captured on there. So going back to what we were trying to do as an open science policy platform, I mentioned we had these recommendations, and I think and we also had these expert group reports that came out, and I think what we felt was that there were a number of key elements here. One is around making sure that we move away from not just evaluating the sort of products and outputs of the research, but we also make sure that we assess the integrity of the research process, which will improve the quality of the research and integrity of the process more broadly, and move away from simply outputs. Also a crucial thing, I mentioned we've got hundreds really of metrics and indicators that we can use, and it's very easy to kind of look at those and go, well, which ones can I use? But actually that's kind of the wrong end, and what we want to do is make sure that we're thinking initially about what is it we're trying to achieve, and what are we trying to measure, what are we trying to achieve, and what are we trying to incentivize, and then what tools do we need to measure that, and what indicators, of which we may have some, we may need some new ones, but it's kind of doing that the other way around. And then, and this was very much driven by our chair, Eva Mendes. The second mandate was about moving beyond declarations and moving to actual practical implementation and pilots. And I think it was a crucial key element of our second mandate. And you know, the feedback we were getting from a lot of groups is there's real desire and interest of moving to alternative metrics and approaches, but a real lack of knowing where to start. And, you know, yes, Dora are capturing a couple of examples, and there are a couple of examples here and there, but actually it's very hard to find in general lots of examples, and to be able to find examples like me, you know, examples in my situation, in my discipline, in my type of organization, you know, whatever it is, and how have they done it, and did that work and didn't it work, and being able to learn and build up, you know, that evidence that people need to do it. And that's really what led us to the idea of the Open Science Registry. So we have a page, currently quite a simple website, but Hilary put together this great looking page for the Open Science Rewards and Incentives Registry. Website's there down at the bottom. Do go and go and look at it. And this is where we will be, you know, increasingly adding more information about it. And the idea, as I say, is to start to create a registry around some of these examples and, you know, pilots and implementations of responsible metrics. The focus is to make sure that it's highly structured. I mean, that's crucial to this. So for those of you that are, you know, familiar with clinicaltrials.gov, which is a website that tracks clinical trials, and you actually have to, if you're going to do a clinical trial, you have to register it there. And you initially register the fact that you're going to do this clinical trial and what your measures are, what your outcome measures are going to be, and you decide them up front, you know, who are the people, how are you going to do it? And then there is a commitment with that, that you come back once the trial's done, and in fact there's a time commitment on that one, that you have to come back and report the outcomes and what came out of it. And so really we've kind of used that essence as the thinking behind this registry. So I say highly structured, so it's searchable and you can find examples like me, essentially. And we wanted to have those two stages of the process. So you do the initial registration in terms of what you're planning to implement, how you're planning to track it, when you're thinking of that you will have got enough data to be able to analyze it, and then a commitment to return whenever is sensible for that particular implementation or pilot, as in when you would have enough data to really be able to assess, did that work or didn't it? Likely 1 or 2 years later, but you know, obviously flexibility about it. So, but a commitment to come back and report on the analysis of the impact that that change had, both the positive consequences, but also the negative consequences. And really, given that, you know, a lot of open science is about having the fair data there, you know, really with a commitment where possible, recognizing that some instances, you know, just like in health data, you know, it's not always possible to share the data, but where possible, to make it, at least to make it fair, so that the right people can access where appropriate. And then, as I say, make sure that we've got open evaluation of those pilots and dissemination results, so that we can use those successes to support uptake by others and broader adoption, or indeed learn that actually don't go down that route because that didn't work, or these were unintended consequences. It turned out it happened, and we can all start to learn from each other. Types of pilots, just to give you a sense, the idea is that, you know, it can be a range of types of organizations. You know, the most obvious ones are research funders, research funding institutions, and to some extent publishers, but there may well be others as well. And it's also, to the point earlier from that Wouters report, you know, is thinking about this at a range of different levels. So there could be domain specific, it could be at a national level, institutional level, even at the stakeholder level, where you may be implementing pilots, or indeed, you know, more sort of ongoing implementations. So I'm now going to hand over to Katrina. I'll carry on driving the slides, but I'll hand over to Katrina to just explain a little bit more about the sort of use cases we think might use this, and also give a sense of how it might look. So hopefully it starts to create a bit more of a picture in your head. Over to you, Katrina.
Right, thanks, Rebecca. And just want to sort of emphasize as well, there's sort of two really key things to this idea of a registry. One is that you post and make public what your intention is about the pilot and all the change in policy and the intervention. Then you come back and say what the outcome was, given what your intention is. And it's not a database, but it should point to, wherever possible, where others might find that data, if they can, if it's not too sensitive. And so it can be independently analyzed. It can be used as an example, or even you could think about having meta-analyses of a suite of studies, just as we have, within science in general. You can have a bunch of negative results, but actually when you put them all together, they come up with some different interpretation or idea. And so it's really to start to almost get institutions and funders and any other stakeholders involved in changing the way researchers and research outputs are evaluated, to think much more about the evidence base, because most of the stuff we have at the moment is anecdotal. And so next slide, sorry, Rebecca. So the idea is, and we haven't, we've only just started, who are the sorts of people that might be interested in using this? What are the use cases for a registry like this? And so it might be a funder who hasn't implemented any changes and looking for new evaluation criteria for their grant panels. Maybe it's in a specific discipline, a specific region of the world. It could, you could cut it, and they say, well, what else is out there? Is there anything else that I can use? Or it might be a policymaker wanting evidence that actually changing the rewards and incentives in a certain way does come out with data sharing, if that's what they want. Or it might be an institution research office wanting to change promotion criteria for junior faculty, and how that would be implemented, and what changes happened as a result of that, perhaps to the diversity or the type of faculty that they're promoting. Or it might be, and this is again really important, because this is a part that really isn't available at the moment, because the data and lots of people are doing, and lots of institutions and organizations are doing all sorts of really creative things. But it's self-reporting. It's saying what works. Often it's not saying what doesn't work, and we really need to be able to expose that to independent researchers who are studying the impacts of metrics, bibliometricians, other types of researchers, people looking at evaluation. And you can start to extend this. We might have department heads, or a chair of grant award panel, HR directors, someone at the research, the REF equivalent, the research assessment exercise in the UK. We haven't really started to think, and one of the things that we want back from you is initially is perhaps some ideas. Well, yes, this would be useful. You haven't thought of that in this particular use case, although that would be the real research on that would be further down the line, which we'll explain later. And so the next slide. So so this is me on Miro. Forgive me, I don't know anything about web design or user interface, but what we want to do is just to try and sort of capture, as a user, you come in and you want to find a study. And so you want to be able to search for the type of organization. Are you looking for a funder, a RPO, an institution? What size? Is it thousands and thousands? Is it small? Is it a particular region? Is it a qualitative study? There might be surveys, that sort of thing. Or is it a quantitative study where they're actually measuring very tangible quantitative outcomes? You want to perhaps focus down on a particular discipline, particularly maybe perhaps a timescale study. You're looking for something that was a 6-month study that showed something, or you're looking for actually, and I think the reality of these things is they're going to take years. So you might want, up to 2 years, 2 to 5 years, or whatever. Again, the size of the study, potentially what sort of metrics were included, if metrics were included. And then you can think about, well, what's the intervention level? So was this at an institutional level? Was it at a departmental level? Was it at a, an entire funder? And we, this is where it starts to get hard to think about this, and this is where we need real input into what's feasible and what's practical, and also the researcher level. Is this at a faculty level? Is it at junior faculty? Is it early career researchers? Maybe it's PhD students. And so the idea is that you're able to search and find for the sort of thing, the sort of study you're looking for, or you can broaden out and get a whole bunch of them. And then if you go to the next slide, the mock-up of the search page, well, this is what goes in here is up for grabs at the moment, and how we get structured is. But ideally, you would have, as Rebecca said, very, very structured information to be able to both track the study, so things like where the study was located, when it was first submitted, so it might be submitted but not actually made public for a couple of weeks or a month, so then when it's posted, when it was last updated, when the actual study started, which will always be after the submission date, because you post your intentions, and then when you estimate, that you're going to complete the study. This is a 2-year study. When the actual final collection date was, you can imagine sort of the very specific tracking information, metadata type of stuff. And then there's more descriptive information. And here I just made one up at random, and God knows how you would do this, but this is incentivizing data sharing, changes to the promotion criteria for early career researchers, tenure track, particularly around data stewardship and data sharing. And this is a wish list. I'm going to collect all sorts of different data, both before and after the intervention, and for ECR. So basically monitor what we're doing now, then make the policy change, then collect some data and see what's happened to the way both the early career researchers perhaps are being selected, and what priorities perhaps they're putting on, how they're presenting their work, how they're managing their data stewardship, maybe even the extent to which there's different types of data training in the lab. If you incentivize different criteria, is there a focus on who does what where and how that's maintained? And here we've got the intervention level, departmental, researcher level, early career. So there's that sort of thing. And then you can imagine going into this more, the details of the intervention, the types of data collected, what were all the study outcomes, whether there were data available, there's data available about this study, and if there are any publications or resources, or it could be websites or whatever about this particular study. So it would give you a sort of one-stop shop. None of it is housed by the registry. It all goes out, to if there's data available, let's hope it's in their institutional repository or in Zenodo or Dryad or other places that are collecting general sort of very heterogeneous types of data. So that's basically it. And I think the next slide, we transfer over back to Hilary.
Thank you. I wonder just, I'm going to stop for a moment. There was a question in the chat from, I think it might have been Karsten, before I move on. Was there also a question in the survey just presented focusing on HR departments? Did you want to, Karsten, do you want to ask that question directly, or did you think you got, because Eva answered a question, but I don't really know, and I thought it might be nice to break, because that was when.
I think there was an answer. I know. I don't think it was an answer. So I mean, the survey actually asked regarding the focus of the scientists themselves, depending on what actually they think is important for their career, and the other one was the funders. So the question is, if you, for example, if you apply for a faculty position, and you've got the panel. Actually, what's the question regarding people who are involved in the decision on who to employ regarding the importance of, I don't know, open data, or is it just the papers in high impact journals?
So I think that's the EUA survey you're talking about.
Yeah.
So my
Yeah, the first
understanding
one.
of that, yeah. So my understanding of that is that the universities who are members of EUA were the people who answered that question, and then they were given that range of options of, you know, what do you use as and what's most important when you're evaluating your researchers in careers. What is it
Okay.
that you focus on? And their focus was very much on the
Okay.
publications. Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, good. Yeah. Thanks.
Good. No worries.
That's a pity though, but okay. That's
Well,
the way it
yes.
is.
Absolutely. Yes. Not good, really, but yes.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll move on. I don't know if there's any more questions. Oh, that was Eva in the chat. Okay, I'm going to move on a little bit and just talk to you about, like, very briefly about governance and sustainability, because the TBD there is also to be discussed, to be decided, to be determined, whatever way you want to interpret that. But of course, as I think, and I hope you've understood, we're like very much at the initial stages of this. And while there are some very concrete ideas around the actual registry and the fact that we wish it to be open and we want it to be inclusive, we're obviously will have to define also the governance and the sustainability aspects of it. So far, the idea is that, well, initially managed by RDA is a fairly large work, because it really is a collaborative effort with my colleagues. But we have set up that website, and it was a purpose, like a clear decision as well, to make it not to use the RDA branding on the web platform. Because of course it's much more, it's broader than just the research data, and we feared that by tying it too closely to the Research Data Alliance, that might not give the correct message. Of course, we want it to be independent, and there are many different roads that you could evaluate, including an independent legal entity. There are costs to running one of those, of course. But what is important, I think, is that it should be not for profit. It should adhere to those principles of open infrastructure. It should be community governed, or at least those are our thoughts as a collective group so far. And of course, it needs the representation of all the stakeholders that are key to this, the success of this, but also the use, if you like, and ensuring that it, you know, the effort or any investments that's made in it in terms of finances and resources are clearly of added value and spent well, if you like, and a bit like RDA, and like I say, it's a collective thing. If we don't all contribute to it in all the phases of this registry's life cycle, then we may miss very important pieces. So as you can tell, we are thinking of the governance, and I think that should be, Rebecca and Katrina might nod on the screen there if we will go then towards those questions in the discussion aspect and ideas that you might have. We obviously have shorter term ideas about how we can actually work together in a less structured way. But it's true that when we think about how this should be, we need to think perhaps where the road that it should go down. Is a legal entity the most appropriate thing, or are there other solutions? Or should it be, you know, adopted by somebody or fostered by somebody for some time? And then, of course, there's the sustainability aspect. And of course, in the short term, the way we feel could be the most appropriate for the funding is through grants, but that longer term, that's perhaps like many of the funding aspects that there are in these particular circles, that we would probably need longer term funding because you also need to show on the user side and the demand side that, of course, that this is a sustainable thing. We are seeking a small grant at the moment and have some funding in Europe to definitely next year to help work this through, but there's no money in the bank at this moment in time. We will also invest our efforts in trying to encourage the funders and present it to the funders to understand how important something like this would be and how they, you know, could and should support us. So obviously, we want more than just a sort of once-off grant from institutional bodies and from funders. And then there's the question: is there a membership model also a model that could be investigated? So I think just some seeds on the ideas around the governance and the sustainability. We did present it briefly to the RDA Funders Forum last week, but it's quite an overwhelming meeting that, and there was a lot of detail on it. But we seeded the idea, and we did discuss amongst ourselves as well the concept of having perhaps specific stakeholder webinars around this particular activity that we're proposing, and obviously dedicating it one for the funders to get their feedback and hopefully their interest and their funds. So I think that's it. Did you want to add anything, Katrina or Rebecca, about the governance of sustainability? We go on to the next slide. I don't know, is that still mine? Oh, how to get involved. Yes. So of course there are different ways that we envisage, and I think that at one point, this is a very sparse slide, it's my fault, but I think you would see, we would like to see there would be different stakeholders on this slide at one point, you know, and there would be a way of getting involved and a way of supporting for all of them. Of course, the first two that we are focusing on at the moment are the funders, and of our top priority, our top way of them getting involved will be the funding. But not only actually, because the important part also would be for them to provide the data and to provide the evidence for change, and to sort of feel like drink their own champagne and be sort of, so they would be on both sides. They would be supporting it, but also providing content to it. Another way that we hope the funders would support us is through the endorsement and dissemination of the initiative to the appropriate contacts and appropriate colleagues, to make sure that we truly do get the word out and ensure that it is, you know, underwritten by all. And then the active involvement in the scoping phase, which is the phase that we are, if you like, I think we can call it the one we're in. So that while it's in definition, we can ensure that it actually responds to the needs of what the funders would see as well, and we can ensure that it is developed and conceived with all those ideas and those inputs. And then the institutions, of course, have the same. So we won't be asking them for funding, though if anyone wants to give it, we won't say no. But of course, from an institutional perspective, it's the same, disseminating it, endorsing it, actively being involved so that we get the institutional perspective, and then, of course, committing to use the actual registry and to put the content in and do the analysis afterwards and do all of those different processes that both Katrina and Rebecca were discussing. So that's sort of on a higher level. There's a how to get involved directly for all of you later on. But I think we're going to Anna now to give us an insight into where does Dora come into all of this.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Hilary. Rebecca gave a fantastic introduction to Dora at the beginning. But so just as a little bit more like to context, so the declaration was released in 2013, really trying to be a call to action. And about 2017, we received more funding that allowed us to turn into an initiative to actively campaign for change and really seek to have those principles in the declaration implemented in institutions in meaningful and impactful ways. So right now we've developed some tools to facilitate implementation, and we're in the process to doing so. So I just briefly want to touch on what they are, and then I'll talk about how they tie into this project. Earlier this year, we came out with a set of 5 design principles that are intended to help institutions experiment with and improve their research assessment practices. And then we followed that up with strategies on how institutions can address cognitive biases in academic assessment. And both of these things really are tools to help institutions experiment with and improve their academic assessment practices. So they really tie back in so nicely with the registry because they're sort of enabling that experimentation that can then be documented and built upon and learned from. We have a couple other tools in development. We're building a set of structured case studies on institutional change for research assessment, which is a collaboration we're proud to do with Spark Europe and the European University Association. That database will be released hopefully in mid-December. But again, coming back to this idea to encouraging experimentation, we're collaborating with Professor Ruth Schmidt. She's a behavioral design researcher at the Illinois Institute of Technology on a framework that institutions can use to help them analyze the outcomes of experiments and interventions to improve assessment. So really, we see all of these tools as a way to help institutions experiment, and then, which of course feeds so nicely into the registry where they can document and keep track of what worked and what didn't. All right, and I think now I'm happy to turn it over to Katrina, who's going to do the Mentimeter survey.
Yes, I am. So this is the first time I've ever hosted one, but so let's just hope it works. And thank you to RDA for lending me their Mentimeter code. So I'm just going to wait till you can all enter your codes, and then
I put it in the chat there as well, so people can copy it.
Okay. Okay. Okay, and then I'm going to share my screen and hopefully it will work.
So I'll stop sharing then.
Yeah.
Catriona, before we go into the survey, I'm just trying to understand what this is. So you were talking about the studies, right? When you were showing a kind of mock-up interface.
Yeah.
So the plan is to track different research studies and attach them to different indicators, or I just didn't quite.
Well, I think the details, no, it's essentially, so the idea, say for example, we know the University of Ghent has done some really interesting stuff in trying to change their evaluation policy. If you wanted to repeat what the University of Ghent had done, where would you go and find the information? How would you find out what they did, whether it worked or not, that sort of thing. There might be particular metrics associated with that policy change, or there might not be. I mean, this is why, you know, this is very much an idea at the moment, and it comes out of the sort of clinical trials type of thing, the evidence base for different interventions and treatment. And what we're doing within the whole system of evaluation is everyone over the world is experimenting with different interventions to try and get researchers and institutes and measure open science and collaboration and you know, to make data count, just to echo Daniela and others. But there's no way that anyone else can see what they're doing, what it is they've changed, what metrics they're using, how they're doing it. So it's the idea at the moment, the slides I showed as the mock-up is just incredibly broad. So what metrics are used in a study? So maybe someone does decide to use, and Rebecca, chip in, downloads of data sets, say.
So this is not studies, but piloting changes, right? I mean,
they're pilots, yeah, studies, experiments,
so,
pilots.
I mean, there are other examples like the Quest Center, and then they develop their own tools, and, you know, for digging into the publications, is there a link to data or stuff like that? I mean, which is also part of sometimes of websites, but it's hard to follow what.
But I think it could even be broader than that, because it could look within the sort of culture of the lab at the moment. Much of the problem about data sharing is there's a lack of support for data stewardship. There's no training at a young age for how you maintain data at institutions, and all of that. So can you change a culture or a policy that puts more value on data stewardship? And if you're doing that, how might you show that what changes you've made, how you measured them, and got the answer that you wanted. And Rebecca, chip in.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And you know, and did it work ultimately, or didn't, or did it have a consequence that you hadn't thought of that actually meant it was a real problem, or in fact maybe it was an additional positive response to it. So,
I mean,
absolutely.
we know with the current system is that, you know, it was never Eugene Garfield's intent that the impact factor would become such a powerful tool, but it has, and that was a consequence that people didn't anticipate necessarily. And so what we don't want to do for any research output or for any researcher is to repeat that sort of thing and not be aware or try and get as much evidence that things perhaps are not going in the direction that you want them to go in.
Carlo has his hand up.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No, it's fine. You probably can't see, but
yeah, no, carry on. Yeah.
Carlo?
I think it's a connected question. My question was about the granularity of the object which are attached to the indicators, no matter what the indicators are, because we may have publications, authors, data sets, or if we go into, for example, scientific services like the one which will be produced in the EOSC, you will have data which will be generated on the fly by queries submitted by the users. So what is the granularity for the element which will receive the evaluation according to your indicators?
We don't know. That is what we need to work out. So you know, we have this from the mock-ups I showed you. It's all big picture. You know, wouldn't this be wonderful if everyone just found there was one place where we could go and find out and search for particular types of interventions to the way research objects and research outputs of researchers are evaluated. But none of the detail. It's a complete blank page. And it just comes from what we think is as a basic need, that there is no evidence out there really about what works and what doesn't work. And how would you even begin to collect data? And would institutions and funders be willing to actually share that data? Because, you know, it's like publishers doing surveys and, you know, does peer review work? Oh yeah, absolutely. And you know, and how and where's the data? And so I think it's about, you know, getting funders and institutions to also think, well, you know, when researchers come to us and we want them to share their data that support the conclusions for the studies they're doing and make it all open. So let's just treat this like another sort of research process, scientific method, evaluation. And, you know, this will involve the arts and social sciences too, because it involves politics and culture and all sorts of things. It's not just hard quantitative science. So, but this is where we're at. You know, maybe it's just too big, and what we need to do is, in the scoping thing, is focus it down to something really simple and much more, you know, narrower in scope. But it's just essentially at the idea: does the idea of a registry or this sort of registry is it worth pursuing, even, you know, as a start?
The other small concern was about the mission, because if we are going into this, I think it's a really good idea to have this kind of registry. But this implies that we will have implementations using of technologies and hardware, machine, etc. And if we go through the chart of RDA, it is said it's technology agnostic. So I'm afraid that choosing a given technology for implementing these kind of things may be seen as a contradiction with this idea of being technology agnostic.
So it's not a technology. All it is a registry. It's just like a list. It's just a database. So whatever technology an institution or funder decides to use, and it might not be technology driven, it might purely be very, you know, human resources plus the funders plus, you know, getting together to work out what their it could be completely different. Every case study could be completely different, both in the technology they use and their approach they use, what they're measuring, the context they have. And all this registry is a list, essentially, a place where you can go and search who did what where. It's not housing the data, it's not housing the policies. It's just a tool to see who did what when, what their intention was, and then go to another page to find out what the summary of, you know, the outcomes were, and to link out to any data that they have, or publications or web pages or best practice.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking of the example of, I think it was Rebecca who mentioned this, that, you know, some institutions or governments or funders are moving away from metrics and starting to look at more qualitative evaluations. So I don't know how you would represent that in this kind of framework. But
yeah, I mean, I think that's where we need social scientists, because that's what they do all the time, qualitative analyses, and I mean, Rebecca and others, you know, chip in, please, but I certainly don't have the experience. But what we definitely don't want is hard and fast metrics replacing, you know, we want the much more context driven, much more granularity, using both qualitative and quantitative measures where appropriate, and working out which are appropriate where and where when. Rebecca.
Yeah, I was just going to add. I think because I noticed also in the chat sort of similar comment, and I think maybe we're sort of inadvertently using the word metrics in our head, I guess, with meaning more broadly than that. So I guess that's the point of things like the OSCAM, where you're not just looking at metrics, you're actually recognizing a broader range of things, and you would recognize them in whatever is the most appropriate way, depending on what it is that you're recognizing. You might, recognizing teaching and peer review and all sorts of other things. So it's about, not just outputs also, but it's about recognizing behaviors and all sorts of elements. So metrics is only a part of it, but I think there are
and metrics aren't always quantitative. It's
exactly.
Qualitative. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, so no, because there are hands up and there's a queue for the hand. So I'd ask you, actually, just to be fair to those who are using that feature, to do it. It's down somewhere in your beside your name in the participant list, you put your hand. Katrina and Rebecca, if Birgit, Ari and Daniela are in, that's the order. If we take those 3 questions and then go on to the Mentimeter and then go back and then
I mean, we don't need the Mentimeter. It was just, I mean, let's see where the questions go. I mean, the Mentimeter things is this a good idea, and who else can we do? So I mean, we
keep the discussion going.
Yeah.
Very good. Good.
It's not necessarily. Can I first?
Yeah, Birgit was before you, Ari. Sorry.
Anyway, that's what she said, at least. So I only wanted to point to the Quest Center example again. I mean, they did some good work in the sense of coming up with awards. I mean, for like publishing null studies, reusing data, and then of course they want to measure as well. I mean, you want to look at the qualitative impact of these incentives, and then you of course also need additional ways of how you measure this. I mean, the effects of what you did. I mean, saying, do they change their behavior now? Do they cite data more or reuse data more? And then it's of course, a method which is, I mean, could very well be documented, not just in a blog post on the DORA website, which is good, a good pointer to examples, but a more systematic approach, which would certainly help in the sense that you have to break down these pilots to smaller items, which can be reused, and say, okay, this was an intervention in this direction, and then you can compare and pick and choose and see if this works for your environment. But I like the idea very much. I mean, in terms of making this better visible.
It's exactly that. It's exposing what people are doing, enabling others to repeat what they've done if necessary, and to provide some sort of evidence base, qualitative or quantitative, or however it's done. There's, scientists out there who know this, how to do this much better, about whether these things are working the way they want, because we know the impact factor and the focus on publications is not working. So how do we get to a stage to work out what does work? And it's not, yeah, absolutely, really emphasize Rebecca's point. It's not about trying to find some hard and fast quantitative metrics to replace the impact factor. It's completely the opposite.
Thanks, Katrina. Ari, now it's your turn.
Thank you. So a couple of comments in here. First of all, I think that first of all, I like this. I think this is a really great idea for many purposes. I really liked also the fact that you're also approaching institutions and their incentives, because the whole point of impact factor, why they're using it, is, at least in Finland, how your university gets funding is according to how many students graduate and what is the number of publications in and the whatever level of publications from different sources. So if this one is the fact that what the universities are paid for, that's the kind of people what they are hiring, because that's the whole business model there. And so I do agree that that's a very important part. Second point of it, what I wanted to mention is about talking about intervention, which can be very difficult to do in this kind of a situation because you cannot control the environment. So just to give you the example here, and which I would think that you can say that is this a kind of thing what you're looking for, is that in my own faculty of science, I led, together with another professor, we complained about this thing, and we ended up with a working group built in the faculty on open science. We ended up with recommendations, and some of the recommendations included, and there was a lot of discussion, pro and con, for open science, not only publications, but all the scientific products. And we ended up with recommendations, and these recommendations were now approved by the faculty board, which means that right now, if you get a new professorship, they have to, in their CV, also explain which of the publications were open access and which were not. And also of all the scientific products are separately listed. It doesn't give them any specific value. So we didn't put any metrics there whatsoever. We said that this is up to the whatever board selecting the persons, but at least they have the information. And the same information is now collected from the units and also in the tenure track evaluations. So this seems to be an intervention, but how would I measure this? Because at the same time, the funding agencies have changed. They are saying that we need to get more data products out and more open science products out. And at the same time also that it kind of changes the environment and also the publications. You publish in Nature, they want your data set there. So I don't know, can I get this one out of the data in my faculty? That did this do any change whatsoever? Is there a real change in the behavior? I wouldn't know how to measure. I'm not a social scientist, as they say. But is this the kind of thing what you want in your database?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really interesting point. You're right. It's hard to do a true experiment in the sense that you can't control all the other things that are also potentially affecting you. You don't quite know which is the factor that's hopefully made a shift. If you see a shift in now more people are publishing open access, is that because of your policy? Is that because of the funders' policy? I mean, I guess, the more and more of this data that we capture, I think we'll have a better sense. So in a sense, volume will help us in that regard. I think one of the important things that it will enable us to capture either way, which is probably, equally important, is either if no change happens, there'll be something interesting, and equally if unintended consequences and researchers start doing something else, that's going to be really, really important to capture. So almost the positive outcomes will probably be harder to attribute to what you've done versus maybe some of the more negative outcomes or lack of outcomes. But again, I think maybe volume of pilots and across different groups may help us to start to at least see there's a general trajectory. And in some senses, if the trajectory is going in the right direction, that's kind of what we're all aiming for anyway. And whether we can necessarily pin it to this or that, yes, it would be helpful, but it probably matters slightly less if it's at least going in the right direction.
I would also say that in a very narrow sense, the intervention from me and the other professor, how we got this one through the whole faculty board, that was already an experiment itself, and it changed the policy. Of course, I don't know how it affects.
Which would be lovely.
Else.
And that would be
Great
lovely to
capture.
document. How do you get a policy change through senior faculty who've been brought up in one system and are quite resistant potentially? I'm not. Yeah. I also think having controls is going to be really difficult. This is where actually our analogy with clinicaltrial.gov really starts to break apart, because we're dealing with a lot of qualitative policy type stuff. And this is where we need input from people who actually know about this. But again, I think even thinking about, well, how do I know if my intervention is working is a good question for people and universities and institutions and funders to ask. Are we getting what we want? And maybe this will help that.
Birgit, could I ask you, if you're finished with your question, to lower your hand, because I see the list. Thanks so much. Daniela, it's your turn.
Thanks. So Katrina's mentioned a couple of times, she's alluded to some work that a couple of us on this call have done for years, the Make Data Count project, which is an example of a project that would be indexed in this. We have been working to do the open infrastructure and bibliometric studies to get to a point of understanding what the right structures to evaluate research data metrics would be. My question is, if we, back to you all who are proposing this registry, the biggest thing that we're coming across right now is that we have commercial entities that are telling us they have out of the box data metrics ready to go. We are not going to be able to build as fast as they can market that those are ready, while we're trying to do bibliometric studies to understand how people use open science information and disseminate it. And so my question really is, how do you see the registry as playing a role to help aid these open science projects that are in alignment with these registry values, and help leverage some of these projects you're going to be indexing to actually be able to get to that point of having people trust and want to understand studies instead of just defaulting to out-of-the-box products in this space?
I think that's a really important question. And I think we need to address that. I mean, what I suppose the only, just thinking off the top of my head, if people buy out-of-the-box solutions where you don't get access to the data behind it, you don't understand what it's doing, I think it's a bit like the initiative for open citations, which I have an interest in, personal interest. So the initiative for open citations just means publishers who put their citations in Crossref allow them to be made openly available. That immediately means that independent researchers can start to track and build up information about who cites whom and the data in an independent way. There are two major companies that also have that data, Clarivate and Scopus. And the issue with Clarivate and Scopus is it's fine, we get what they present and they do it very, very well, but it's not feasible for independent researchers to get in behind and get access to the data. And so I think this registry is an appeal to institutions and funders to actually to commit to something that reflects their own values for open science. And so buying something just off the shelf that we don't know the consequences of, maybe, there's not in the spirit of all the policies and things. I know that sounds far too evangelical. I think this is something that would be really worth discovering. Discussing. What would be really nice is if the registry got populated with stuff that Make Data Count could use. You could find the data you needed that you didn't know was happening in somewhere else that you hadn't thought of, and that it just gets exposed. And then I don't know. What's your answer, Daniela? That's nasty of me.
It happens to be a really difficult thing that we're encountering. It's come up a lot this week.
Yeah.
And so I'm just trying to understand how the registry, what the role the registry plays as I'm trying to connect the dots, being on the kind of incentive side. How does the registry help leverage some of these incentive initiatives? And that's
yeah. One of the things is that, Rebecca, is that the registry might help coordinate. So Dora can see that it wants to be involved in this. It would be fantastic if Make Data Count also wanted to endorse this. And if lots of organizations trying to do the same thing with the same values endorsed it. Rebecca, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the only thing I was going to say is I wondered whether if there are examples that are added to the registry that are using more open data, that then enables others to analyze it and really sort of dig into it. It might, given part of the purpose of the registry is to find sort of similar examples to you and help decide whether to do something similar. It might, the fact that you can delve into it yourself much more and understand what's behind it might mean that organizations decide to take a similar approach to examples that have used more open measures than ones that are using more closed measures where they really can't assess what's going on. So there might be an element in there that, I don't know whether that's true. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but it might help to encourage people to use more open metrics and indicators, and possibly.
Also sort of see that the registry, because you're sharing the outcomes of the experiment, like whether it's objectively positive or it didn't quite turn out the way that you had intended, that it really shifts the perspective from like, oh crap, we did this experiment, it didn't work, let's just go back, to the idea of, okay, how is this an opportunity for growth and an opportunity for learning? So it turns it more into a process for change rather than thinking of it as a failure.
Okay, can I ask Irina to make her point? And then I think it's John Chodaki has a question in chat that we should address, but Irina, you go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Hilary. So I just had this week 2 meetings with rectors' committees and ministries in Ghana and Myanmar. So that's a context out of which I'm speaking. And what's really helpful to them is to know that other universities are changing their research assessment practices. And they're not really interested in exact details. So I was just worried that what if there will be no studies of some examples, so someone would say we did that and then a researcher wouldn't want to follow up. So maybe it could be something like, if you indicate that you are going through this process, please come back in a year's time and tell us whether there were any changes. But then also another question I have, how soon will you have results to report? Because, for example, Ghent is changing their research assessment. They will only know in 3 years' time. Do you want to wait for 3 years to hear back from Ghent? And I'm also, what you showed as clinical trial example, registry, it would be to off-putting for rectors in those countries. So I think they need something more kind of human. Thanks.
That's really good input. So is there a way that we could make this more user-friendly in different regions? Is that sort of what you're saying, or you're saying that it would just crash and burn anywhere outside, sort of?
Well, maybe there could be different levels to that. So maybe some stories could be stories and with some follow-up,
Yes,
and some other could be like real studies with lots of data, like for those who really want to dig in. So if you have this layered approach.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be great. So there's sort of optional entries. So you can go for the huge, big University of Ghent study if you want. And I think we're going to have to wait. It's like these things are going to take time. Or you can go for, but you can use the registry just to find a local case study that's much more, just less structured. I think that's definitely worth putting into. Don't know about the others.
I was just going to add, I mean, obviously the great thing, as we can see, particularly in the work that Dora's already been doing, is that there are examples that have been running for some time. So it's not that we will have, hopefully anyway, they will have a registry that won't have any results, as it were, in there for a long time. You know, there are things that have been done already that we can encourage to start to report. Okay, they will be reporting what they were planning to do and the results in short succession, but at least we should have some examples and hopefully some analysis of that earlier. But I think equally, as just like it is in clinical trials, it is important to wait an adequate length of time. Otherwise, we could end up with results that are misleading because we haven't actually given it. We think, oh, it's fine, and we don't see the negative consequences that may take longer to emerge, for example. So it's a balance between the two, isn't it?
So will we take, it's just 20 past, so we've 10 minutes left, but there is one question in chat, which I'm not sure if John wants to ask it or if I just read it out.
Either way, yeah.
Go ahead, John. Nice to hear a different voice.
Sure. So I think that the conversation started off, I felt, in one way, discussing these really important initiatives. And I think that somewhere along the way, we're really focusing on those initiatives and not on, it feels to me, we're discussing less the idea of an open science registry itself, right? I mean, the work being done around assessment and ideas around changing the way we deal with the credit system and the way that we talk about open science in general, those are all important things. But, and there's no but, there's a period. Those are all important things. These are all very important initiatives. So the question that I have is, how do they actually benefit from this idea of a registry? Because I still don't, in my mind, I don't see the connection. It's not that I couldn't in the future. Some of the examples that are being brought up, I feel like they become ways for, the examples that I can think of, including clinical trials.gov, they become ways for people to gain credibility and for people to exert evaluation criteria on the studies themselves that then themselves become part of the way of gaining credibility. And so I guess my question is, where has it really worked? And how would we make sure we weren't hitting like those pitfalls? And how would these really important initiatives actually benefit from this idea of a registry?
I think clinical trials has worked. My understanding that the clinicaltrials.gov is not used as a metric of evaluation itself. It's actually, within the health medical fields, it's compulsory. You have to register your clinical trial. It's just mandated, and then anyone can search for, and again, they've got different sort of levels of trials. So maybe I'm missing, maybe I'm not understanding.
So my primary question is, how will an open science initiative benefit from the existence of an open science registry?
Hillary, would you mind if I take a go?
Oh, please do.
Again, I think as John, I would agree with John that we've kind of gotten off on a bit of a tangent in terms of assessment and the nature of assessment and all those kinds of things. But I think any registry that contains information that those in a particular community can use as models to develop their own approaches, policies, whatever the case may be, has huge value. Whether it's simply as a time saver or to try to facilitate alignment nationally or internationally. So I think having a registry of this type is quite exciting, and I think it would definitely have a positive impact. I don't see, the only thing I would disagree with what John suggested in his chat. He suggested that it could have a negative impact, I think. or actually be hurt by such a thing. I don't see how that could be possible. Having said that, I think, again, the more information we can make available to people in a consistent, standard, structured way, that facilitates one of many possible approaches to embarking on an open science trajectory is good. No question in my mind.
I mean, so just to answer the question about how it could be heard is there are literally tens of thousands of open science projects around the world. And if a registry becomes part of a way to gain credibility or to share information, and those projects do not, for whatever reason, through access to the understanding that the registry exists, or because of the way that the registry is set up, if they don't include their information, it can be seen part of an evaluation of their systems and what they're working on. And second, the registry itself will have some sort of schema around how it allows people to display information or put stuff in. And if it doesn't directly fit the use cases of open science projects, it can become part of that as well. And also over time, registries can become stagnant, especially when they don't have requirements like clinicaltrials.gov. And so over time, those that got in, and then as it got stagnant, will become part of like a version of the database of record that will then kind of be set in stone and will not evolve over time. And so these types of things will exist and will happen. And I can think several of them that have happened. And it just becomes a problem for the community. So the question is, how would this be different?
Well, I think we just we'd have to actually scope that out as one of the pros and cons of this.
Yep.
I see what you're getting at. That the registry itself will, by the way it's structured, will exclude or potentially exclude, and that sort of speaks to Irina's point about the example she gave in Ghana at the moment, that they wouldn't want to contribute, I think that would have to, be factored into how this was designed, built, and governed. I mean, at the moment, one of the big issues, and this is it's not about all open science, it's just about the rewards and incentives side. So it's nothing else. It's just about what are people, organizations, funders doing to change the rewards and incentives, and what impact is that having, if there is one. It would be as far as I can see, a voluntary thing. But at the moment, we're in a position where there's two things: that there are lots of initiatives going on trying to change the policy of evaluation and rewards by, Wellcome Trust and others, and no one else gets to see what they've done or whether it works or how it's done. And it's a way to try and encourage funders and institutions to be more transparent about one of the systems that has most impact on research careers and things. And so that's where we're trying to get to, but we don't want the registry itself to have an unintended consequence. So, this is a good conversation that needs to be factored in, and maybe, I find it hard to really see the hugely negative consequences. I mean, I think getting institutions to experiment and expose, and getting funders, I mean, it would be great if we knew whether what Wellcome had done had changed the behavior of their researchers.
It sounds like a design principle rather than a reason not to proceed.
Okay, yeah. So this
on
is
that note, I'm going to stop you. I'm afraid I'm going to stop the conversation because we have 2 minutes left. And I think there's just one thing I wanted to say, which is, this isn't a monitor, it's a mutual knowledge. Maybe we could look at it from that perspective. The concept was about sharing knowledge and, However, the thing is, the last slide was about how we could get involved and how we could further this conversation. Of course, we're looking for funding to scope it, as we go back to stating that this is a scoping exercise. So all the feedback that you have given, which is just, I think, skimming the surface of the different aspects, positive and negative, that it must be are in the scoping. So We didn't do the Mentimeter that Katrina spent time doing, but there is a Google form there. And I think what the best thing to do would be to, I know you've put your emails in there, but so we can sort of work together, just because we're trying to coordinate this, is to how we can further this conversation. And we thought that a mechanism of an interest group through RDA would be a good idea, because it's always open and people can come into it. And then, and also, of course, to try and further the activity. So I don't know, I think on that, I suggest then that as we gave you the access to the slides, you have the access to the collaborative notes. We invite you to fill in the Google form, put your name in the form. We will be catching up with each other and the colleagues that are not on the call, including Michelle, who's been helping us an awful lot with this. And then investigate and maybe put out arrange a meeting and hope that some of you can come in. I know it's not easy, but we do some more of these discussions. What do you think, ladies? Have I summed up okay? Because okay. So I hope it's not to stop the conversation, but unfortunately we have to stop it. I think 90 minutes isn't enough.
Oh, that's great. I would love to know, though, just from the people here, one of the is on balance, do you think this is an idea worth pursuing or not? How could we get a vote on that? Is it possible?
Maybe in the chat.
Well, I wonder if people did the first thing on the Mentimeter. If people logged into that, the first question
I think
is a good idea.
I think I've upset the Mentimeter.
Yeah, you can just press on the participant list, and then there's yes and no.
Yes or no. Polling.
Yeah, that'd be ideal. Yeah.
It's just a cat out. Cat has decided to go out. Okay.
So just go down the participant list.
Yes. So I see 2 or 3 people have said yes on it. I'm not sure everyone knows that so if you open the participant list, and at the bottom there's a series of commands. One is yes, no, go faster.
Ah, I see. That's great. That's great. So you can vote on that. So the question is this an idea that's worth pursuing? Should we carry on and try and scope out what this looks like, warts and all?
Okay.
Pursuing, still discussing, right? Or already implementing?
Oh, no.
We're nowhere near implementation.
Oh, no.
All we have is one web page and the domain name. That's it. Yeah. Everything else is there. And it's just how can we introduce a more evidence-based approach to the evaluation system?
I guess it's a hard question to answer, because I'm not sure I think RDA is the right place for it to happen. So if the question is, yes, it should happen at RDA, or should it happen at all?
Yeah, or both. Should it happen and should it not happen at RDA? That's fine. You know, we certainly don't want it to be the RDA to be the barrier. We're aware of that, by the way, that it's a. So that's also, a very good point.
Yeah, that was definitely one of the questions, so RDA is just managing the discussion, but it might become its own separate legal entity, which was
or discussion group. I mean, wherever,
or something completely separate. But okay, so that means we've got 9 yeses.
Well, 9 are saying yes, some not sure yet, whatever. So I think the point would be, we have that email list of those of you who filled it in from the notes. We'll get in contact with you, suggest some ways of going forward when we've reflected ourselves, and take it forward from there, if that's okay.
Great.
And thank you all for participating actively.